You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are here in our final week discussing Eric Redman's Death in Hilo. Chapters 28 to the end. All spoilers are on the
spoilers.
Table. And Herds.
Flex. Yeah?
I have had a great time reading this novel, but I also must confess, what in tarnation?
What do you mean? What in tarnation? What specifically? We found the killer. You were 100% correct at every twist and turn. You get all your points. That's happening. I like to get that out of the way.
The first thing that actually happens in this stretch of chapters is that Emma Phillips / Emma Gray runs into Ellie and Jarvis.
Oh my goodness.
At some markets, and Jarvis recognizes Emma because he used to work with her father, and basically spells out Emma's name to Ellie. But unfortunately, because Ellie puts it together out loud in front of Emma, Emma then invites Ellie to coffee, and she gets abducted and horribly killed.
This doesn't happen immediately. Like, we don't know that Ellie's just been killed.
I was so confident she was not going to die, by the way.
She 100% is dead. Like, that just happens. But this is the thing. You know how you've been doing this thing where you, like, cut off chapters just before the relevant murder? This is my revenge.
You
because
monster.
even though it doesn't happen on screen, it very clearly happens. It is coded that way. This scene is ridiculous. But yes, we talk to the old grandma in the corner. We talk to Jarvis, and we learn what's really going on. We basically, in that scene, spell out literally the name of the killer.
There's this big sense that, like, this is the reveal now, and Kavika is working the rest of the novel to catch up.
And at this point, we're about 70% of the way through the novel. When I got to this point, I remember thinking, what on earth are we going to spend the rest of the novel doing? If we know who the killer is, and they're right there, where are they going to go? All of their stuff is still in their house. They can't move quickly. What are we going to do for the last 30% of this novel?
Good question, Hertz. What are we going to do?
We do a manhunt or a woman hunt, as the case may be. They put together a police investigation very quickly. This is the fastest and most intense police investigation the whole novel, because we're, chasing someone who is of personal import to the characters that we've met so far and has a name. Very quickly, we begin to lose hope, and the body is found by a woman and her dog that she's like trained to track corpses, basically. But that's how we find Ellie.
Should have stuck it on Jerry Rhodes' car.
Stuck what on Jerry Rhodes' car? The body?
The dog.
Oh, the dog. Oh, okay. I see. Yeah, you would have thought that the dog would have smelled something by now, but she's not part of the police force. They don't have canine trackers in the police force in Hawaii, apparently. So we find Ellie's body just in a shallow grave, the most disrespect, and that element is kind of turned around by the end of the story. Kavika kind of goes back after all is said and done and turns it into a little memorial, just a couple of rocks so that he can remember the event, which is really very touching. But the rest of the novel is Kavika rapidly putting together the same thing that his wife did, and we end up in a revenge story with the other cops kind of putting things together independently. Kuale figures it out. Tanaka is there for the whole thing. And they say, well, if Kavika tried to call Emma and Emma's up at the observatory, oh no, we got to get to the top of the observatory to have a big showdown.
The other thing, like, character-wise with this story that was really interesting, Ellie gets killed and we sort of don't have a resolution to her character and the journey that she's been on, like coming to terms with Jarvis and what's happened to him and like writing this story to deal with that. Yvonne, like,
she gets to shoot her sexual predator. Which is, I can't think of any other blunter way of putting that, but like that's what happens.
And Kuale, I guess, gets to shoot the bad guy. So we have all of these characters that we've been following around who kind of come to these resolutions that are like all violent and don't feel as though they've latched onto anything narratively.
We have all these women in the novel that are important, and they all end up shooting somebody. I mean, not all of them, but 3 out of the 4 sets of killings are carried out by women, because you got the culprit, Emma, and then Yvonne.
And then Anna kills Kavika's career.
There you go. Four of them. All 4 of the women in the novel killed something. Although it should be pointed out that there is a sense that Kavika's personal loss is used as a bit of a narrative device to make sure that Anna doesn't completely ruin his career.
Yes.
Like, there's this whole scene where she tells the reporters, like, well, we've kind of decided to just let sleeping dogs lie in light of recent events. And essentially, she's doing this partly to gain power. She advances her own agenda, which is selfish, but also karmically in the novel, it's so that Kavika doesn't suffer any more than he already has. Like he's already gone through enough near-death trauma.
And he's gone through it in a lot of respects because of what he did, it seems, in the previous book, that we still don't know.
Which we don't know what actually happened, but you're right. It all ties back together. And there is a sense that he has suffered adequately for his previous ethics crimes.
Yeah.
And it culminates in a scene where Anna shouts at reporter Zoe for daring to attempt to dig into a previous police matter that was mishandled, which is an interesting way to kind of end Zoe's arc.
I think it makes sense for Anna's character because she's clearly making a power play, but the subtext is bizarre. I had a lot of fun with the end of this novel, but in some ways I feel like the 3/3 of this novel all felt like discrete stories. Each of them kind of played stronger as a short story than they played as a collective whole. The 4 parts of this story all do something so discrete that doesn't really feel like it links in. You know, the case with Jerry Rhodes is kind of over by the end of part 1, and we just wait around to see the conclusion in part 4.
A murder mystery doesn't always have to be like a puzzle to be solved discreetly, but we don't get any new clues. There are no named bodies introduced, and it doesn't tie in with the other murder case.
They don't learn anything from the slasher case that helps them find Emma, for example, or the other way around.
The way that the slasher case is resolved, Yvonne just is told that there's a suspicious character lurking about, and she's like, oh, it's the slasher. And then she shoots him many times, which she is criticized for.
Yeah, like, you know, you could read into it and say that perhaps because she's been mentored by a monster that she's picked up something horrible from him, and what are the consequences of that? But the novel doesn't do that legwork itself.
I do think that there is a theme there because both Kuale and Yvonne are the juniors, either directly or indirectly, of Kavika and of Tanaka, and they're like past sins. I want to see what Eric Redman does with that theme of younger people taking up the sins of the previous generation. It is, to me, one of the themes that I'm most interested in. Although, honestly, I just would have liked to see more of the TMT situation, because I would actually like to see a murder mystery that involves like the members of the TMT being characters for more than one chapter and actually getting involved and kind of doing a political thing.
Or like, at the very least, that we like would have learned some lesson from talking with the 30-meter telescope people.
They don't provide any actual clues, and they are not related to the actual murder case at all.
That is the biggest weakness of this novel, is just that there's a bunch of really interesting plot threads here that don't end up being tied together. And to some extent, in the real world, there is not necessarily narrative overlap between all of these things that can be going on in tandem. But I think that the suspension of disbelief that we sort of provide as readers would have allowed us to get a lot of mileage out of making those links to teach us something.
It's just very broad. I shouldn't say that there are no themes or lessons in this novel, but it is painted with a very broad brush, which definitely is unique. It takes a town, has a similar deliberately broad brush, and there is one scene towards the end that takes the characters that have a similar lesson to learn, and it puts them in the same room and makes them learn that lesson. That's the sort of scene that this novel could have used to kind of pull everything together.
And I think there's a lot of other good stories in terms of like Michael Tearawa Bennett's work and David Hesker-Wombly-Wyden's work, which really do a good job of integrating cultural context that the stories are trying to exist within into their crimes in a way that is a bit more nuanced than the upfront revenge plot, which is what we kind of hinge on here. And I think that like that integration is definitely something that I was left pondering at the end of this story.
I would love to see his revenge story sort of hinge more around that Hawaiian culture and be staked around something that he deeply cares about.
I think the 10-year gap between these two stories and the consequences thereof and how little things have moved actually is a really interesting thematic tie-over between the idea of the 30-meter telescope and Kavika's career. There are still plenty of really engaging hooks that do tie things together in this book, but I need more.
I think that a little bit of extra oomph would have made me like completely sing the praises of this novel. I say everything that I say lovingly. I want to see more of this series and of Kavika. I want to see him dig himself out of another hole.
He'll be having his midlife crisis by the time we get to the next book.
That's true. We got to do another, maybe even a longer time skip for the next one. I think that'll be fun.
Either way, you're listening to Death of the Reader. We are talking Eric Redman's death in Hilo, all the way to the end of that story. Spoilers are on the table. You're listening to 2SER 107.3. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are talking with Eric Redman once again about his very own death in Hilo, our current feature novel on the show. It's a delight to have you back again, Eric. And I guess we wanted to pick up the conversation where we left it off, which was talking a little bit about crime fiction protagonists who leap too quickly to conclusions. I think there's a really interesting game between the two kind of key crimes here going on in the novel, where the audience has so many opportunities to be ahead of or behind our detectives. How important is that relationship with your readers in terms of keeping them ahead or behind of the characters in the story solving the crime?
There are certain rules of detective fiction that you still have to follow. There used to be like 20 rules in the golden age of detective fiction, but now there are some rules that just make sense. For example, you can't have the killer be some minor character that you introduce at the end of the book. I mean, that just doesn't work because readers naturally want to be trying to figure out, who did it. A second rule of detective fiction that my editors were quite insistent on initially, and I just explained I wasn't going to live with it, and that is there is nothing that the detective knows that the reader doesn't know. But I decided that the flip side of that is not a rule, and that is there's nothing wrong, in my view, with the reader knowing things that the detective doesn't know. Because rather than just one single aha moment, and rather than the book being a simple whodunit, it's meant to have an arc in which the detective is discovering who did it and is discovering a lot of other things along the way. And the reader is discovering it and is in suspense, not just about who's the killer, but how and when is the detective going to learn what the reader already knows?
I honestly think it's one of the strongest things in this book. I mean, especially when we're in like the first stretch of chapters, in the sense of dramatic irony, as you mentioned clues that to the characters in the story, they're like, oh, well, that's inconvenient. But to you as the reader, you're like, no. I, through the hand of Eric Redman, got in this story, know that this is relevant, and thus I see the trap you have fallen into, Kavika.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, there's a literary device called proleptic irony. And proleptic irony is something that becomes ironic, but only in light of other things that you read about later. So at the time, you don't realize the irony, which is why sometimes there are books you want to go back and read for a second time. In both of these books, if you go back, you'll see that he and others overlooked a lot of things. But for the reader, when you read them, you think, I'm going to try to hold on to that. That might turn out to be important. A lot of murder mysteries are designed as puzzles to be solved. And that doesn't mean they're bad. I love them. I read them myself. But my ambitions were more literary than just doing a puzzle.
So there is a sense that the machine of crime solving forced Kavika to make hard choices. In your last novel, young trainees like Yvonne and Kool-Aid are set to be burdened with the same trauma that underscores the more senior officers that train them. Do you think that's inevitable?
I don't know enough about every aspect of the real world of policing. But as you say, in the second book, these two young, in their 20s, young detective trainees, and they're being trained and they're learning. But what I like about both of them is that they are able themselves to have insights, to come up with solutions, to think things through and make suggestions to Kavika that when he thinks about it, he has no reason to reject. So I think that kind of partnership between the mentor and the mentee, in which the mentee is not just a pupil, but actually kind of a junior partner in thinking these things through. And I wanted these two women to contribute a lot, and I think they both do.
We were talking about Knox's rules for detective fiction just before. And the other thing that I found interesting, if we go to one of the other great rule sets of the golden age of detective fiction, Van Dyne's rules, Rule 12, says that there must be one culprit no matter how many murders are committed. But there's a sense as you launch into Death in Hilo that there is more than one, perhaps more than two. And with the park slasher and the copycat that seems tied to Bones and Hilo's case, and the criminal who gets out of prison at the start of the novel, there's a lot going on where most novels try to avoid having disparate crimes. How do you wrangle all of these disconnected cases without losing a sense
You
of
shouldn't have
focus
mentioned the
in book.
rules, Redman. You've done it now.
Let me mention that in the golden age of detective fiction, remember, they set most of them up as puzzles to be solved, right? What I'm trying to do, you have a problem. In the real world, a homicide detective encountering a body, at that moment, the entire universe, 4 billion people on the planet are potential suspects. But because of the rules of detective fiction, that it can't be a minor character coming in at the end, you have a problem that, unlike the real world homicide detective, all the suspects have to be characters in the book. So you have a chore, which is, if you want any suspense at all, the reader can't know from the beginning who the killer is. So to me, one of the ways to push against the constraints that imposes upon you is to have multiple murders where you can also have at least the possibility of multiple different killers. And I think that that is part of the realism. I mean, if you think about a homicide detective doesn't have a career in which they have just one murder with nothing else going on in their lives until they solve that murder. And they've got a number on their plate. And in Kavika's case, he's got a number on his plate. And then it turns out this investigative journalist, she wants to drag him back to an earlier one. So then he's got 3 at least that he has to manage. And then it turns in the earlier one, well, there were 2 people killed in the earlier one. So now both of them become things that he's got to try to figure out how to deal with her on while he's still trying to solve the other 2 murders, one being the serial killer in Honolulu and the other being the body that's found in Honolulu with no head and no hands. So you have to juggle a lot of things. Does it become too difficult for the reader? Do you lose the reader if you get too many layers of complexity? There, I think, is where you really have to balance it. And you don't know. There's a lot of difference among readers. I've had people say to me, what I loved about this was the many, many layers and the complexity. And I've had others say, God, you lost me in there. I couldn't figure out. I had to go back and diagram it, things like that. So I don't know that there's one right balance for every different type of reader. I don't think that's probably the case. But you have, when you're writing, you have in mind a hypothetical reader. And my hypothetical reader is pretty darn intelligent. Let me put it that way.
I understand that you're a lawyer, you got a stake in climate activism, and this book is all about crime-solving ethics in police work, in science, environmentalism. I'd like to know how you feel that elements of your own sense of justice shine in the Kavika Wong series.
I come from a family of lawyers, a family of prosecutors for that matter. My own sense of justice, obviously, I don't want people to get away with murder normally.
It's a good one.
Normally, I wouldn't want people to get away with murder. It's quite interesting, isn't it? There is no detective fiction without murders. I think we all have this kind of dissonance, which is that in real life, murder is the most horrific thing. But in reading detective fiction, we're reading it partly for that thrill. And so murder in a detective fiction plays a different role. And justice plays a different role too. I've had 2 murders in my own family that certainly have informed me about what it's like to actually be in the family of a murder victim. And it's not very much like detective fiction. Although in Death in Hilo, I tried to really convey, in Kavika's case, what it's like having to deal with murder at a personal level, not just at a professional level.
I suppose that the last thing I wanted to ask there, Eric, talking about like your family's connection with homicide, is there a sense of catharsis from you that comes in writing controlled stories about homicide, given your personal history with that horror?
Yes, but that's a huge difference between the 2 books. The first book is a first novel. In a first novel, it turns out you have a lot of autobiographical stuff. You have a lot of stuff about your own life that influences how you write and what you're writing about and propels your writing. My brother-in-law had been murdered in 2001. He was an assistant U.S. attorney. And almost immediately, all of us and also all the regular authorities knew who was responsible for his murder. There was never any question about who was responsible for his murder. And yet, no one has been prosecuted for it 23 years later. And the reason is that it's very, very complicated. It involved federal law enforcement agencies as well as locals. And so jurisdictionally, it was a mess. And in the real world of murders, if the murder doesn't get solved in the first few hours and days, the chances of getting solved go down very, very rapidly. In the case of the murder of my brother-in-law, I read in the newspaper one day that sources close to the federal investigation said This may be one of those cases in which you know who committed the crime, but you are unable to bring him to justice. And that so infuriated me that propelled me to write as I did. And if you read Bones of Hilo, you can pretty much suspect, you can probably figure out I had to kill the killer myself, because even though I knew who it was, in the real world, I couldn't touch the person. And as it's turned out, no one else has been able to touch him either.
Yeah, well, Eric, it's been an absolute delight reading through Death in Hilo and kind of exploring these concepts with you. So thank you so much again for joining us here on Death of the Reader.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Hertz here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We'll be back with more of Death in Hilo in just a second. Stick around on 2SER 107.3. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Hertz here for your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are talking Eric Redman's Death in Hilo all the way to the end of that story. I have been in the hot seat, and Hertz, I'm almost disappointed in my predictions.
What do you mean disappointed? You got pretty much everything that was important, right? The only thing that you outright got incorrect was the survival of Ellie. You had an inkling of that literally at the beginning of the novel.
I suggested it in the first week because I felt like we were getting a lot of death flags, but then they stopped happening and we started building relationships with other characters, and I'm like, oh, okay, she's going to like be the foil to Kavika's ex, and we're going to get some interesting stuff out of that, but she dies. She just
dies off screen too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good on her. What else are you disappointed about, or is that the big one?
One of my favorite things about this book is the fact that Eric so boldly lets you get ahead of the characters in the story, as we were talking about with him. And I really enjoyed the fact that all of those clues about Jerry's case early in the novel, where it's like us as the audience have so many opportunities to see that, oh, Eric has written this, and thus I know it is relevant for the story. That was really fun. More of that, please. But I also think that one of the big pieces that it was missing from that is the then recontextualization of that.
This is the sort of scene that the denouement would have done really well, but we kind of get that flipped on its head in this novel, where Kavika is the one being explained to by Emma Phillips / Grey in her evil telescope lair up in the mountains.
The clue last week that finally set me over the edge on what the actual motivation was, when we get to Emma's whole confession, the only new thing we learn, the only context we get about that is that, oh, he confessed because he was feeling guilty after seeing this thing in the newspaper. But like, we already knew all of that.
Yeah, and he just happened to confess to the exact wrong person. I remember when I was reading through the book, I had a theory that it was going to be a setup, that someone had kind of provoked Keone into confessing or moved him in the direction of Emma Phillips because they knew what was going on. I feel like maybe having an additional layer of some ironic movement of the murder victim towards the psychopathic killer. That's essentially what Emma Phillips is, which is not my favorite trope. Like, her motivation is revenge, but the way that she goes through her, like, I'm going to confess to you, and just, I feel like that sort of representation is not great on either end. I can think of worse, mind you, but like, generally having your killer just be crazy is not very empowering.
I think there were so many obvious hooks that we could have there to kind of make things a bit more robust. I think the flip side of this is the dramatic / proleptic irony throughout this book is one of the strongest things that's going on there. I think that some of the ways that we close particular doors by having certain characters run into certain characters and make you realize that the mystery couldn't have happened certain ways, but not completely, really, really compelling. Like, when we do meet Keone's different lovers, we sort of knock out the opportunity of it being his lover in Hawaii because they're like, oh, well, he was really distraught and there's like no way that it could be this person, and the sort of authorial intent that is obvious through that sort of writing. I really enjoyed the kind of confidence that the novel played a lot of that with. And I think in contrast to Too Much of Water, as we've mentioned a little bit, like, Too Much of Water was a bad book that was interesting through its failings. And I think this book is interesting through its successes in spite of some failings. And that's one of the things that makes this book, I think, so compelling to read. There's not a lot that you have to keep track of because of the amount of work that the book is doing to kind of support you as you go along. I think that Some of the unusual plays that it makes in the directions that its mystery goes are really unique, really fun. It is, I think, a book that is something that I would definitely suggest more to people who enjoy discussing fiction than enjoy reading fiction.
I do enjoy how many times the novel more or less just tells you what's going on. The line that we brought up last week where Ellie says, "Oh, Kavika, you've just left Tommy with the impression that one of Gray's children killed
that line was fantastic.
And he's like, "Oh, I can't believe I've left him with that impression that that's what's going on." And that's what's going on. Like there are a few lines like that. And I mean, similarly to the work of Benjamin Stevenson and other sort of more explicitly metatextual murder mysteries, I do really enjoy mystery stories that kind of just tell you what's going on without necessarily making you certain that that's what's going on, you know? They give you a level of reasonable doubt, which is where the irony comes in for the characters, of course. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah, it is a really strong book, and I definitely know particular slates of people that I would heartily recommend this book to, but it's not the sort of same universal recommendation. Like, this is, I think, an enthusiast's choice in certain contexts, and I really respect that.
Although, to be clear, Redman has said this is not like a Golden Age detective fiction story in that it is a puzzle to be solved, which is what we normally cover on the show. So to some extent, that is going to color our perspectives on the novel.
Yeah, and it was really good, hearing from Eric earlier about like how he was sort of informed by active consideration on Golden Age stories. I really liked that, and I think you can see those qualities come through in the book in a way that does shine. Like, we have been very critical this episode,
out of love,
as you say, because it's not something that we typically deal with. And as with any review, you want to cater your perspectives to like your tastes, and I think this novel is outside the tastes of this show, but still also has a lot that we can glean from it because of those tastes.
At the end of the day, this is the Murder Mystery World Tour.
Yes.
Like, we can't just stay in 1920s Britain or whatever.
What are you suggesting, Herds?
We can't just read Christie forever.
Well, Herds, I do have to pick the next book for this episode.
Oh, no.
But first, you need to give me my points.
I think you just get all your points.
All right, excellent.
I don't feel like there's any debate there. Also, I'm pretty sure I said in the previous part of the show that you get all your points. So there you go.
Oh, thank you. Well,
you get 3. You only get the points once, but I said you got them twice. I'm not going to give you them twice.
Here I
That's
was
not
trying
happening.
to double dip.
I can see.
But yeah, Herds, I was tossing up between two books. Michael Tayarawa Bennett's Better the Blood. Absolutely love that book. One of my top picks of 2022.
You've raved about it to me before.
Except, Herds, I just discovered that Michael Tayarawa Bennett has put out a sequel.
You discovered, did you? This is all you? This is your discovery?
Yes. It was completely independent of any co-researchers in this program.
Yep. I definitely have nothing to do with picking any books.
And I think, Herds, it would be much more fun for me to try have a crack at Hannah Westerman's second novel if you give that one to me, which we have underhandedly behind the scenes agreed to do.
Yeah, no, let's be clear. There is a rather horrifying series of messages between the two of us where we're trying to figure out if we want to do Better the Blood. And then I'm like, you know the sequel? And you're like, what? Anyway, let's do this Christie one first. Let's get that out of the way. Let's do our taxes.
We are going to do our taxes for this year, continuing on our exotic island stretch of stories. I don't know how we ended up doing this, but I figured we'd stick with the theme.
For this. Look, I figure, The Simpsons was basically an island of comedy.
Exactly.
And we've only gone up from there. So,
Texas, an even bigger island at that.
It's Dallas, yeah. That's right.
We are going to be covering Agatha Christie's A Caribbean Mystery, the 10th Miss Marple story, chapters 1 to 9 we will be reading. This is one of a few Miss Marple stories with some recurring characters in it.
Wait, are they characters we've seen or just generally?
No, not characters we've seen, but characters that are important to the Marple canon. And the other thing that's quite fun about it, Herds, is that there is solid contention in Christie academia on this one as to whether this book is Christie's best way to make her holidays a work expense, or whether this is her true return to form. If you ask me, Christie's form is holidays as work expenses.
I'm really excited to find out what that actually means. That's wild. Look, I'm ready to go to another island adventure. I tell you what, maybe we should make this a work expense. Let's go get some research done.
Yeah, let's do it. Get some flights, tax times coming up.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
This is Death of the Reader, your murder mystery world tour. We will be back with Agatha Christie's A Caribbean Mystery next time on the show. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Eric Redman for sharing this book with us here on the program. Catch you around. We're out of here.